Hey guys, it's Mad Tzen here. I'm going to show you how to make graffiti art in Procreate. So get your iPads ready and do a draw with me, and we'll get started in just a few moments. Welcome back, fellow artists, and if you're new to my channel, welcome. I'm Mad Tzen and I'm a digital illustrator. I create Procreate tutorials for beginners. Welcome back, guys, and let's get straight into the tutorial. So first things first, we're going to look at the canvas size. On the screen, you'll see that I've presented the pixel width and height that we'll be using for today's tutorial. If you're not sure how to create your own canvas sizes, I have a tutorial that shows you how to do that, which I'll leave the link above and also in the description below. Throughout this tutorial, I'll also leave other links that will help you in using Procreate tools. Next, in the brush library, go to the calligraphy category and we'll be using the monoline brush. Then I'll go into the color wheel and I'll choose the colors as I go. So I'm going to start off with the color brown. Then go to the brush size and make it 60%. For the lettering today, we're going to be doing the word graffiti, and the style of font I'll be drawing will look like a bubble font. So I'm going to draw thick letters. We want a new layer for each letter, so once you've done your G, go to layers and add a new layer, then toggle off the G. So let's go ahead and draw R, remembering to make it nice and thick. Once you've done R, go back to layers, add a new layer, and toggle off the R. Then I'll draw A, and I'm just going to continue on with the rest of the letters until I have what I need to spell graffiti. For the I drew an exclamation mark. Now in the word graffiti, we have two F's and two I's. But in this case, you only need to draw F and I once, since we'll be making duplicates of both those letters later on in the tutorial. Once you've done all of the letters, go back into layers and toggle on all of the layers underneath. Then you need to select all of your layers by swiping right on each one until they're highlighted in blue. Then click on the transform tool so that we can resize, and we'll bring it over here to the side for now. Then I'll go back to layers and choose G at the bottom of the list, and I'll use the transform tool to drag it to the left. Then I'll go back to layers and choose R, and again use the transform tool to drag it next to G. I'll continue this process until I get the letters in the position that I want them to be. A lot of graffiti artists like to overlap their letters, so I'll be doing that in this tutorial today. Go back to layers and make a duplicate of F, then use the transform tool to slide it to the right. And I'll also make a duplicate of the I. Then I'll drag that copy to the top of all the layers. Then I'll go back to the original I and I'll work on that. Then I'll position the T. Now you can keep making adjustments by making the letters bigger or smaller and also shift them around until you're happy with how the entire design looks. Don't be afraid to use the erase tool and redraw your lines if some of your lines seem out of place. When you're happy with everything, go back to layers and select all of your layers. Click on transform and make the word larger. I'm also going to center the word to the middle of the canvas using the yellow cross. Even at this stage, you might see some things that you need to adjust. That's okay. Just go ahead and make those adjustments. When you're satisfied with the final result, go back to layers and highlight all of the layers, and then click on group up here on the top right. Then click on this down arrow. Once they're all grouped together, make a duplicate of that group and toggle off the group layer underneath. Then what you want to do is click on the layer above, then choose flatten from the list. I've decided that I want to make the outline of the words thicker, so I'm going to go ahead and do that. You'll notice that I'm not going over all of the lines. That's because those thinner lines are the ones that I'll be erasing. And you'll see the final effect once I've erased those. Next, we'll go back to layers and we'll make a duplicate of that layer. Make sure that the second layer underneath is highlighted in blue, since we'll be working on that layer next. And you're going to toggle off the top layer this time. Then go to the color wheel and choose black. Then drag black onto the outline of each letter before filling in all of the letters in black. Now you want to go to layers and toggle off background color, then toggle off the black graffiti that we've just worked on, then toggle on the top layer, then click on the plus icon to add another layer under the top layer, then click on the top icon to bring up a list, then go down and click on reference, then click on the empty layer underneath. Next, go to color palettes and choose white, and place white inside each letter. Next, we'll go back to layers and toggle on the background color layer. Next, click on the white graffiti icon and choose alpha lock. Now going back to the color wheel, I'm going to choose my colors randomly. When choosing colors for graffiti, you need to make sure you choose strong and vibrant colors. So I'm going to start with orange here, and I'll place the orange on the top part of our word. Then I'll go back to the color wheel again and fill the bottom part with purple. Then I'll go back to the color wheel and choose a strong pink, and I'll place that in the middle. Next, I'll go to the adjustments tool and click on Gaussian blur, and I'll drag my pen until I reach 24%, giving our colors a nice gradient effect. Then go back to color palettes and click on the black graffiti and toggle it on. Then click on the transform tool and drag that a little bit towards the bottom left, creating a shadow effect behind our word. You might have to play around with this a little bit to make it look right. When you're happy, click on the transform tool to commit. Since I've added the black shadow, I want to position everything in the middle, so I'll go back to layers and highlight those 3 layers and just move it around until I see the yellow cross again. Then I'll go back to layers and click on our colored layer, and I'll add a new layer above. Then I'll go back to the color wheel and choose white and lower my brush size to 10%. This time we're going to draw highlights on our design. The way to add highlights is to make them look like exclamation marks, and I'll place this at the top half of each letter. Once you're happy, go back to layers and add a new layer. Go back to the color wheel and choose this strong pink here. Then I'll draw on some shading at the bottom of each letter. Then go back to layers and click on N and take the opacity down to 40%. Next, click on the top layer and add a new layer above it. If you don't remember the colors that you've chosen, you can use your finger to select colors from your image. So I'm going to grab the purple that we used earlier, and I'll make sure that my brush size is at 10%. This time we'll be drawing the drips, so I'm going to make it look like there's paint dripping from our word. You have to draw the bottom part of your drip wider than the top part. I'll clean up the corners up here so that the paint looks like it's dripping smoothly from the letter. So I've done one for G, and I'll add another one here on A. Don't be afraid to use the erase tool in case you need to adjust and fix up your drips. Then what you want to do is go back to layers, make a duplicate of the dripping paint layer, toggle off the top layer, then click on the layer under to highlight it in blue. Go to the color wheel and choose black, then go back to layers and click on the second layer icon and choose fill layer. Then toggle on the top layer. Then we're going to click on the transform tool so we can adjust the shadow of our drips. Now I'm going to go up here, and using the erase tool, I'm going to clean up the black parts so that it's not showing up on the colored areas. Go back to layers and click on the top layer icon, then choose alpha lock from the list. Remember that you can use your finger to pick up the shading and highlight colors so that we can use those same colors on our drips. Now I'm going to use my finger to pick up the outline color, which I'll be using to add some effects on the outside of our letters. So I'll go back to layers and add a new layer, then I'll make sure that the brush size is still at 10%, and I'll draw some curvy lines like so, and I'll go ahead and do this on the top of each letter. And I'll also add those lines on the side of G. Then I'll go back to layers and add a new layer on top of all the layers. This time I'm going to take the brush size down to 4%. And I'll go to each letter and draw some squiggly lines like this to make it look like more paint is dripping from our letters. You don't want to overdo this part. You just want to add it to some of the areas where you think is necessary, and it just adds a great effect to your graffiti art. The next thing we want to do is make our graffiti design stand out. In layers, go down and click on the background color, and we'll choose this strong blue. Then I'll go back to layers, then add a new layer, then drag that new layer underneath all the layers. Then we're going to change our brush, so we need to go back to the brush library, go to the spray paints category, and choose the burst brush. Then I'll go back to the color wheel, and I'll choose a bright yellow. But before I do that, I just want to adjust my word and make it a little bit smaller for the spray paint effect that we're about to do next. Then go to layers and click on the last layer, and I'll lightly tap on the screen to add that yellow spray paint effect behind our word. And there you have it. So thanks for watching, guys. Now you know how to draw graffiti in Procreate. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you guys in the next video.